These Easter cake and cupcake ideas are cute, colourful, and surprisingly simple to decorate. I'm going to show you 7 Easter cake and cupcake decorating ideas using buttercream, including homemade stencil designs, speckled egg cakes, piped roses, carved buttercream, and a really fun technique that reveals a hidden design inside the frosting. Most of these use basic tools and simple techniques for impressive results. The first technique uses homemade stencils. Start by drawing or tracing your design. I'm tracing a bunny face from my computer screen onto a piece of paper. Now place parchment paper or wax paper over your sketch. Trace around the background shape first, which will be your first stencil and your first colour. Then trace the details, using a separate piece of parchment or wax paper for each colour. Once everything is drawn, cut out the shapes. When you layer the pieces together, you should see how they combine to create the full design. Chill your cake after frosting it so the buttercream is firm. Next, mix the buttercream colours you'll need. A really handy tip is to use a cupcake pan as your colour palette. Just put a spoonful of buttercream into each hole. They're the perfect size, and you only have one thing to wash at the end. And then start with the background stencil. Pressing it onto the cake, spread buttercream over the top, smooth over it a few times to leave just a thin layer, and then carefully peel the stencil off. If there are any smudges, you can tidy them up with a toothpick. Put the cake back into the fridge or the freezer for about 10 minutes to set that buttercream before adding the next stencil. Continue layering the stencils from the back of the design to the front. And at the end, optionally, you can pipe around the coloured sections to make the design really pop. I'm piping the eyes instead of using a tiny stencil, and I'm scoring the mouth with a toothpick. And there's a buttercream stencil Easter bunny cake. The next cake is inspired by speckled chocolate eggs. After assembling your cake layers with filling and frosting, take your time smoothing the frosting for this design because there won't be many decorations covering up the sides of the cake. While the frosting is still soft and sticky, press colourful mini eggs onto the top in a ring. Now for the speckled effect. Mix 1 teaspoon of cocoa powder with 1.5 teaspoons of hot water. Before splattering it onto the cake, I recommend protecting your work surfaces with cloths or towels because this can get a bit messy. Dip a paintbrush into the cocoa powder mixture, pull the bristles back with your finger, and then let go so they snap forwards and the cocoa splatters onto the cake. This creates a speckled egg effect. It's fine if the speckles land on the eggs too, it actually helps bring everything together. Next is a carrot cake, which feels perfect for Easter. Starting with the decorations, before you add cream cheese to the frosting, set aside a few spoonfuls of the buttercream base, which is stiffer and easier to pipe with. Tint most of it orange and pipe zigzag shapes onto parchment paper to create the carrots. Add green food colouring to the rest of the buttercream, and the leftover orange in the bowl will make the green slightly muted, which actually works well for the carrot tops. Put this into a piping bag with the same small round piping tip, this is a number 4, and pipe 3 little spikes at the top of each carrot. Freeze these for about 10 minutes so they firm up. While they chill, assemble your carrot cake with cream cheese frosting. The full recipe is on britishgirlbakes.com. Smooth the frosting or add texture using the back of a spoon or an offset spatula or palette knife, and then lift the frozen carrots off the parchment and arrange them on the cake. I like placing them where I'll cut the cake later so that they mark out the portions. This is a simple decoration and it only takes a few minutes, but it looks so pretty. The next cake is a carved buttercream design. Start by crumb coating your cake and then spread on a smooth layer of frosting and freeze it for about 15 minutes. Then add another final layer of frosting, but a different colour. Both layers of frosting should be neat and smooth, and the second layer should be as thin as possible without exposing the colour underneath. Chill the cake again until the buttercream is firm, and now dip a clay modelling tool into warm water and start carving into the frosting. This hook-shaped tool works well for things like dandelion seeds, and a round tool can carve larger circular shapes. A pointed tool is great for stems, for leaves, or for the outline of flower petals. After each time you carve, dip the tool back into warm water to remove the buttercream and keep it warm so it glides through the frosting. You can combine colours and designs to create really striking carved buttercream cakes. You can carve cupcakes too. Pipe 2 blobs of different coloured buttercream onto a cupcake using a large round piping tip. This is a 1A. Then flip it over and press down onto a piece of parchment or wax paper and put this into the freezer for 30 minutes to chill and set the buttercream. Now use clay modelling tools or the pointed end of a petal piping tip will work instead on cakes or cupcakes. Next, let's make a buttercream rose cupcake. Use a petal-shaped piping tip. this is a number 104, and start by piping a blob of buttercream in the center of the cupcake to give the rose some height. Hold the petal tip with the narrow part pointing upwards, and pipe a spiral around the blob while spinning the cupcake to form a rosebud. Next, pipe arcs around this. Each arc should overlap the previous one by about half. Angle the piping tip so that the top points slightly inward, which helps the petals wrap tightly around the center. And as you move outward, gradually angle the piping tip backwards so that the petals fan out from the rose. This is beautiful as a single cupcake, but it also looks amazing as part of a cupcake bouquet. Next, I'll show you how to stencil around the sides of a cake. Cut parchment or wax paper to the same height as your cake and draw or trace your design onto it. Cut out the shapes while leaving the surrounding paper intact so it works as a stencil. Wrap the stencil around the cake and spread buttercream over the cutouts. For these stems, I'm spreading the frosting up and down rather than sideways so I don't pull the stencil away from the cake. For larger shapes that are completely surrounded by paper, spread inwards towards the middle of the cutout for the same reason, so that you don't lift the stencil away from the cake. Peel the stencil off and clean up any smudges with a toothpick. Chill the cake before adding the next stencil so that the first part's set. Because the flowers in my design are close to the stems, I ended up making separate stencils so that the colors wouldn't smudge. Ideally, you'll leave about an inch around each shape on the stencil to prevent spreading frosting over the edges and onto your cake. Place each stencil onto your cold cake. Spread frosting over it, scrape away the excess to leave a smooth, thin layer behind, and then peel the stencil off. As long as your cake is really cold, this technique is very forgiving. This final cake uses a technique I call facelift frosting. You pipe a design onto a cake and then turn it into a completely flat design. Start by piping your design onto the cake and freeze the cake for about 20 minutes. Then pipe buttercream over the entire design to cover it completely. Freeze the cake again for another 20 minutes, and now warm a cake scraper by dipping it into hot water or running it under a hot tap. You can also warm it with a hairdryer or a blowtorch. Then start scraping around the cake. At first, it will feel like a terrible mistake because you're scraping away frosting you just piped. But as you continue, the hidden design underneath starts to reveal itself, and it's actually really exciting to watch. The final result is a perfectly flat cake with an embedded buttercream design. And one last quick tip before you take your Easter cakes outside. As the weather gets warmer, remember that butter melts, and so does buttercream. So if you're displaying your cakes outside for an Easter party or a spring celebration, try to keep them in the shade instead of placing them in direct sunlight. Otherwise, the buttercream can start melting very quickly. So tell me in the comments which of these 7 Easter cake and cupcake decorating ideas you're going to try next, and to learn hundreds more cake decorating techniques and designs, visit my cake school on BritishGirlBakes.com. Join my channel membership on YouTube to get access to my perfectly smooth frosting course, exclusive videos, and other perks. Thanks for watching!